Welcome back to the second part of this lecture. We are interested in describing time series or dynamical data xt, and we have modeled that as time-lagged data. So we go from xt to xt plus tau, and we rewrite xt plus tau as yt. So we're always looking at data pairs xt and yt. So those are time-lagged data pairs of our original time series. Now we are looking for an encoding E and a decoding D. The encoding goes from the original full dimensional space to a latent space, and the decoding goes from the latent space, a lower dimensional space, back to the full dimensional space. And we want to find this decoder and encoder such that the prediction error is minimized. So the error of taking data point xt, mapping it to latent space, going back to original space and comparing with the original yt, the original time-lagged data point. We want to minimize that. Now the title of this lecture was Finding the Manifold that is Slow, or the Manifold of Rare Events. We will see later that minimizing this reconstruction error in time is actually equivalent to finding the subspace in which the dynamics or the slow part of the dynamics is found, or the events are most rare. We will see that later. Okay, everything that happens on this slide is linear. So we are looking for matrices E and D that linearly project the original data into latent space and lift it back to the full dimensional space. But we will also later look at nonlinear representations. But so let's solve this problem first. And let's ask the question, which methods give us the optimal KD, so the optimal transition matrix that is low rank, or the optimal encoder and decoder E and D, which solve this minimization problem here. And the solution can be simply found by recognizing that what we have written here is a regression problem. So really we are regressing inputs X to outputs or labels Y, and the matrix of coefficients is the matrix KD. Yeah, so this is a so-called multi-target regression problem. Our label or output matrix Y has multiple dimensions. It has as many dimensions as the input X. And for each of these capital D dimensions, you can view this as a one-dimensional regression problem from all the inputs X to this one dimension of Y. And then if you just repeat this capital D times, you can write this as one multi-target regression problem in this matrix form, where we minimize the regression error of Y tilde and X tilde K tilde. Okay, so as long as we are talking about linear representations, so a linear transition matrix K, then this is just a regression problem, and we know how to solve regression problems. We know, given X and Y, or X tilde and Y tilde, how to find the optimal K tilde, which solves this minimization problem. And here it is. So the optimal K tilde, the optimal transition matrix, which solves this regression problem, is simply the pseudo-inverse of X and Y. So it's X transposed X inverse multiplied by X transposed Y. I'm omitting the tilde here when I read the equations, but you see the tildes are always there. So the tilde again refers to the data being whitened. So we remove the mean and we use PCA to reorient the data and divide every direction by its standard deviation such that it has a variance of 1 in each direction. Now, by definition, when doing this, when whitening the data, the matrix X tilde transposed X tilde, so that is the covariance matrix of X, is an identity matrix. That is exactly what we have achieved by whitening the data. So that means this factor, this matrix X transposed X inverse, simply disappears, and all we are left with is X transposed Y and normalized by the number of time steps, so 1 over capital T minus tau. So this transition matrix, K tilde, so that's the optimal product of the encoding and decoding matrix, which minimizes the regression error or the prediction error of the time-lagged data. Now we want to find two matrices E and D, which make up this product. So we somehow have to decompose K into two parts. And when we look at it like this, there is a certain ambiguity in doing this. There are different choices of E and D to make up the same product matrix K. But there are a few choices that are relatively obvious or meaningful. So again, E and D are matrices that reduce and then increase the dimensionality. So E is a matrix that goes from a full dimensional capital D to a smaller dimension in latent space, small d. In other words, now we want to make an approximation to K tilde that is low rank, a low rank approximation. Yeah, if we take the full solution shown above, the regression solution, which is equal to x tilde y tilde normalized by some factor, then we cannot do dimension reduction. If we want to do dimension reduction, we have to approximate K tilde by two matrices that are going into some low dimensional space and back. In order to do this, let's look again at the definition of K using covariance matrices. So for this, we just write out the definition of x tilde and y tilde. And the definition of x tilde is simply x, so the unnormalized or the unwhitened data. And then we use cxx to the power of minus 1/2 to normalize or to whiten the data. And if we do this for both x and y and rewrite k in this form, we get this form in terms of the covariance matrices. So cxx to the minus 1/2, cxy, cyy to the minus 1/2. That is the same expression as above, just rewritten in covariance matrices. Okay, now we want to approximate this matrix by a low rank decomposition. So we want to replace it by a product of two matrices where we go through a lower dimensional bottleneck. What is the optimal way of doing this? The optimal way of achieving a low rank approximation to a matrix is the singular value decomposition. Yeah, the singular value decomposition of an arbitrary square matrix is an expression that we call U sigma V, and we have the little subindex D in order to indicate how many dimensions are used in the latent space. And these matrices, U, sigma, and V, have the following properties. So U and V are both orthogonal matrices. So they have the property that U transposed U and V transposed V are identity matrices. And sigma is a diagonal matrix of singular values. Yeah, so this looks very much like an eigenvalue decomposition with the special feature that U and V are orthogonal matrices, and in fact for certain matrices, namely for symmetric matrices, the singular value decomposition and the eigenvalue decomposition are the same. Okay, I won't go into more details about the singular value decomposition. It's a standard tool in linear algebra. So if you're not familiar with the singular value decomposition, it may be useful to read it up a little bit more, to do some exercises related to the singular value decomposition. But for now, I just assume this is a tool that we can use. So we take this matrix, which is the product of the three covariant matrices, perform a singular value decomposition, and then after the singular value decomposition, we will have a new representation of K tilde in terms of two orthogonal matrices and this diagonal singular value matrix. And this singular value decomposition now gives us a low rank representation. This diagonal matrix sigma d is small d times small d in terms of size. U is capital D times small d, so it's a projection matrix. It reduces dimension if we apply it to a column vector from the right. And V transpose is small d times capital T, so capital D, so it increases dimension if we apply it from the right. But since our convention is to write the time series data in x and y in rows of x and y, the transposition changes with respect to what I just said. So you apply either from the left or you apply from the right with transposed. So now we have a way to define our optimal encoder and decoder metrics by simply taking the parts of the singular value decomposition. So the optimal transposed encoder matrix is simply U, and the optimal transposed decoder matrix is simply sigma times V transposed. Now there is some ambiguity in this. For example, I could put the sigma instead of in the decoder, I could put it in the encoder, or I could split it. I could put a half power of sigma in each of those. And this is arbitrary. So on this slide, we just have chosen one of the possible conventions of doing this. Okay, everything here has been done using tildes, so using the whitened time series data. But we can simply insert the definition of whitening and rewrite the optimal encoder and decoder for the non-whitened data. And if we do this, we get the following result. We get the optimal encoder that is given by UD, and UD equals CXX to the minus 1/2 times this U tilde that we get out of the singular value decomposition. And in the same way, we can also write the optimal decoder as sigma V, and V equals CYY to the minus 1/2 times the V tilde that we get out of the singular value decomposition. And this way of finding new latent variables from variables x and y that are minimizing this reconstruction error in an optimal sense is called the canonical correlation analysis or canonical covariance analysis, and this is a well-known statistical method. And here we apply this to time-lagged data and obtain a method which achieves this for time series data, but at the same time achieves for time series data that we find the slow processes. This will be shown a little bit later. So we call this time-lagged canonical covariance analysis. Now let us do the same thing, but assume a special case. So we are already assuming that our data is stationary. So that means that the dynamics don't change over time. So that the rules of the dynamics are the same for all time points. An additional assumption that is often true in microscopic systems, so in, for example, physics or chemistry systems that are driven by fluctuations of just based on the temperature, so just thermal fluctuations, and not driven by any external force. There we have an additional property called detailed balance. And what this means is that any pathway, any trajectory from a point in state space to another point in state space is equally likely forward and backward in time. So in other words, the system evolves in equilibrium. That's another way of saying this. And this symmetry, this time symmetry, implies that if we estimate covariance matrices forward or backward in time, we get the same result. So we can use the following estimator for covariance matrices that is shown here. So we say CXX and CYY are actually identical, and they are estimated by taking X, so the initial data, and also Y, the time-lagged data, and we compose the estimator from both of them. Note that I'm not using normalization constants here, like 1 over the number of time steps. So here I would need to use 1 over 2 times the number of time steps. And this is done because the multiplication of these covariance matrices, so the products that I'm taking, will make these prefactors disappear. So I'm ignoring it at this point. But a proper definition of the covariance matrix would require this normalization constant. All right, same for Cxy and Cyx. We say they are the same, and we use both directions, the forward time and the backward time direction, in order to estimate them. Now, if we use this covariance estimator and we insert it into the result of the previous slide, so we compute time-lagged canonical covariance analysis with this definition of covariance matrices, then we get the following. The optimal low-rank decomposition of the transition matrix, which is still Cxx to the 1/2 times Cxy times Cxx to the minus 1/2, which is equal to Cyy to the minus 1/2. This is given by the singular value decomposition, but the singular value decomposition now is the singular value decomposition of a symmetric matrix, and that is identical to the eigenvalue decomposition of that matrix. And it is a decomposition where the matrices U and V are equal. So U is equal to V, and that means UT is equal to VT. And so the decomposition is simply U sigma UT, and U is an orthogonal matrix. So that means U multiplied with UT is identity. Again, we can write down the optimal encoder and decoder matrix with these results, and we achieve essentially the same as the slide before, just that the V matrix is replaced by the U matrix. So instead of needing two matrices, U and V, that project into different spaces, we have one matrix U. So we only need one matrix in order to characterize the latent space. This method was originally derived for the so-called blind source separation problem. So that is a problem that is, for example, motivated by audio signals that are composed by different instruments or by speech from different speakers, like at a party or so, and you want to decompose this audio signal into its individual contributors or instruments. And a linear method to approximately solve this problem has been proposed by Mulready and Schuster in Physical Review Letters in 1994, and that is exactly those are exactly the equations shown above. And later this method has become known as time-lagged or time structure-based independent component analysis, or TICA, and in 2013 we have worked out the relationship between TICA and what is being optimized for a molecular dynamics system. And there you can actually see that if the dynamics obey detailed balance, then what we are achieving here is really we maximize the time scale, or we maximize the slowness of the processes in the latent space, and this is essentially what we wanted to do from the beginning of this lecture. But we do that with a method that minimizes the prediction error from the data to the time-lagged data. And to see this, we look at the following example. So consider the following process. We have a slow process that switches between two discrete states. If I'm in either one of these discrete states, I will sample from a Gaussian distribution, which has a large variance in x and a small variance in y. So it will produce this sort of longish distribution. And the two blobs that you see here are from the two different states. So if I'm in state 1, let's say, I'm sampling from the lower Gaussian density, and if I'm in state 2, I'm sampling from the upper Gaussian density. Now these two densities are fairly close to each other and they're a little bit shifted with respect to each other. So now the task is I would like to have a one-dimensional projection that separates these two distributions well. And because there is a separation here in time scale, so there's a slow transition process that transits between the two discrete states, and there is a fast, actually an infinitely fast, namely an independent sampling process inside the states. This is a timescale separation problem. So if we have a method that can separate slow and fast processes, then we should be able to find a one-dimensional process in a one-dimensional projection in which we can distinguish the two densities. Now, if we use, for example, principal component analysis, then we will get the blue direction. So principal component analysis finds the blue arrow as the first principal component because this is the direction of maximum variance of the entire data. And if we project on this blue direction, then of course the two states that produce these separate Gaussian densities will be completely smashed together. So you will not be able to distinguish the two density modes in this projection. Whereas TICA is exactly finds the yellow direction. So this is indeed the direction in which the slow variables are separated. And if we project the data along this yellow vector, we will see the separation of the two density modes separated by the slow process very nicely. Here is another illustration. So consider that we are starting from the input shown in the left column. So this is a 10-dimensional signal over time. And you can see, well, it's not quite Gaussian, but it does look, it looks like there is some underlying information, but it clearly does not look particularly slow or well structured. So it's really unclear whether there is any interesting data inside under this noise. Now, if we apply principal component analysis to this data, then this is what you get in the second column. You get an ordering of the data into large variances and small variances, of course, but you still don't see any particularly interesting signal. Now, if we apply instead TICA or TCCA to the data, then you get what is shown in the right column. This is denoted as variational approach here because these are variational approaches, but that's not so important now. So the main point here is what you see in the three first dimensions of this transformed data, you really see rare events. So you really see distinct transitions between 2 or 3 different states along each of these dimensions, and then the remaining 7 dimensions are really just Gaussian noise. And this is exactly how this data was generated in the first place. So what I did here is to take a metastable signal in 3 dimensions, so a signal that switches rarely between discrete states and each of them will output from Gaussian distributions that are in 3 dimensions, similar to the example before where you have seen that in 2 dimensions. And then you just add, or I just added 7 random noise dimensions, so 7 Gaussian noise dimensions. And then took a 10 by 10 random matrix, so a confusion matrix if you like, multiply this 10-dimensional data set with this 10 by 10 random matrix, and then what you get is the input data that is seen in the left column here. So because a linear method was used in order to confuse the original data that had a nice separation into slow and fast time scales and produce the input to TICA and TCCA, these methods, because they again find the optimal linear decomposition of the data, will be able to exactly recover the slow and the fast subspace. A variant of these methods is the kinetic method, where we scale every latent space dimension, so every latent dimension with the corresponding eigenvalue. And then we get an embedding shown as shown here. So you see that you have large eigenvalues in the first 3 dimensions, and they correspond to the slowness of the signal. So here slow means large eigenvalue, as in PCA, where the eigenvalues correspond to the variance. Here the eigenvalues in the TICA method have something to do with slowness. The larger the eigenvalues are, the slower is the corresponding process. So the slow processes, they survive the scaling with the eigenvalue, but the independent processes, so they are arbitrarily fast. That means the corresponding eigenvalue is close to 0, or it should be exactly 0, but numerically it's close to 0. And that means all of these processes simply get scaled to 0. And so this method now has the nice property that we don't need to worry about how to choose the dimension to which we want to reduce the signal, how to choose the latent space size, because the eigenvalues will simply be responsible for scaling the fast transitions away, or the fast directions away. And then we can essentially keep the dimensionality of the problem, and we have defined an embedding, so a new space in which distances correspond to timescales it takes to go from one point to another. Okay, so much about linear methods. Now let us take the same idea and define a nonlinear method. And this brings us to time-autoencoders. So here we follow exactly the same idea like in the principal component analysis and autoencoders lecture from last time. So there we have seen principal component analysis is an optimal linear method that minimizes the reconstruction error if we use an orthogonal matrix to project the data down to a low-dimensional subspace and it's transposed to lift it up again. Then principal component analysis is just minimizing the reconstruction error. Now TICA or TCCA are minimizing the reconstruction error in time. So they are the correspondence to PCA for time series data. Now in the PCA lecture we have seen, all right, we can just use the same loss function, so minimize the same quantity, but instead of using a linear method, use a nonlinear method. So use a nonlinear encoding and decoding function, for example, represented by neural networks. And then what we get is an autoencoder. And we can do exactly the same here. And because our input and output data corresponds now to the same data set strided in time or lagged in time, this is a time autoencoder. So what happens here is we take our input data, xt, we apply our encoding network, go to latent space C, apply our decoding network, go back to a full dimensional space and compare the result with xt plus tau. So our autoencoder approximates the time transition from xt to xt plus tau, but is forced to go through this low-dimensional bottleneck. And as in the normal autoencoder, we minimize this reconstruction error shown here. The only difference is the meaning of x and y, because they are basically taken from the same signal lagged in time. And the interesting thing here is that you can show, like we showed for the autoencoder, that it is a linear autoencoder is optimally solved by principal component analysis. A linear time autoencoder is optimally solved by TCCA or TICA, depending on whether we have detailed balance, so time symmetry or not. So let's look at an example of using the time-autoencoder framework to data. So again, we have a slow process that switches between two states, and in each of the state we will output from a given distribution. And in contrast to the distributions shown before, where we have compared TICA and PCA, these distributions have this V shape, so they are not linearly separable. I cannot find a linear projection of these two-dimensional data such that I can perfectly separate the slow process. So now if I generate data using this process and I use PCA, TICA or time-autoencoders, then I get the results shown in panel B. So the green curve shows the result of PCA. I basically don't see at all that there are slow and fast processes in the data. It all looks like Gaussian noise, or at least like noise. In the yellow curve, you see the result from TICA. So here you already see that there are slow and fast processes, so that there are two states, two metastable states, within which we have noise and between which we transition slowly, but the states are not very well separated. Whereas if you use a time-autoencoder, you can find a nonlinear separation of the signal, and that's when you get the blue curve, and here you really see very nicely that there are really two states. They are well separated, and you get an embedding or a low-dimensional latent space representation of the original data in which the slow processes are nicely resolved. Okay, so now we have derived two linear methods, TICA and TCCA, and a nonlinear method, time-autoencoders, in order to solve the manifold learning problem for slow processes in time, given time series data. But we have done that by always minimizing the reconstruction error. So by always saying we use an encoder, either nonlinear or linear, that goes from the full dimension to a low dimensional latent space, and then we use a decoder that goes back to full dimensional space, and we want to minimize the reconstruction error in time. So now in the next part, we will see that this actually corresponds to maximizing slowness, perhaps surprisingly so.